As years passed and massive cultural changes swept the globe, the Berlin Wall remained a symbol of conflict and struggle. Eventually, tensions reached a breaking point.
To learn why the wall fell, we'll need to take a look back to when it was built.
Before the Berlin Wall was built, nearly a fifth of the East German population had fled to the west. The wall and the heavily guarded border that ran throughout East Germany ensured that most of the remaining population stayed within the country's boundaries. While these measures helped stabilize the economy, living conditions in East Berlin did not improve. Working hours were long, life was strictly monitored, and luxuries were few and far between. In the late 1970s, even coffee became scarce. After struggling with shortages, East Germany had to try to find new suppliers in Vietnam. On the other end of the spectrum, social structures such as childcare and schooling were free in the communist system. These institutions still worried the East Berliners who disagreed with the government, since school was the first place that children were directly exposed to communist ideology. West Berlin and West Germany were even eliminated from official maps. Resentment grew among almost every facet of the population, including border guards. Michael Mara was one of more than 1,000 guards who defected to the West. He spent his days tossing notes tied to cigarette packs over the wall to other dissenting soldiers. While life in West Berlin wasn't perfect, citizens enjoyed much more freedom. The counterculture movement was thriving, and artistic life was flourishing. Young West Berliners explored group living in Commune 1. Experimental art pieces and stage productions abounded, and the music scene was vibrant. People were free to live as they chose.
As the Berlin Wall evolved to become more and more impassable, relations between the governments of East and West Germany actually eased slightly. In the first few years of the 1970s, a transit agreement and the Basic Treaty allowed the two nations to establish formal diplomatic ties and expand Checkpoint Alpha on the inner German border to simplify approved travel. And in September 1973, both countries were admitted to the United Nations. For years, life continued separately on each side of the wall. In 1987, as East and West Berlin held celebrations for the 750th anniversary of their city, the US President Ronald Reagan gave a speech at the Brandenburg Gate. In his address, Reagan would call on Soviet leader Gorbachev to tear down this wall, declaring that it would dramatically advance the cause of freedom and peace. In the same month, David Bowie played a concert near the wall in the west. Many East Berliners attended from the other side, and violent riots broke out after the show, laying the groundwork for more and more protests. Nearly 2 years after Reagan's speech, holes began tearing through the Iron Curtain. As communism started to collapse in the wake of Gorbachev's reforms, Hungary turned off their electric border fence with Austria. Following Hungary's example, Czechoslovakia also opened its borders, prompting tens of thousands of East German refugees to head west.
In the spring of 1989, local elections were held in East Germany, but all of the listed candidates were chosen by the Communist Party. In response, opposition groups held peaceful demonstrations and leaked evidence of the election fraud to West German media sources. The Soviets arrested at least 100 of the protesters, but still reported a celebratory mood across the country. A cycle of demonstrations began to grow in Leipzig. 2 independent pastors had been holding weekly meetings every Monday for years, but as summer turned to fall, the gatherings for prayer and discussion evolved into a national movement. On October 9th, 1989, as many as 100,000 people took to the streets of Leipzig in peaceful protest, despite warnings from the Stasi. When undercover officers joined the crowd to cause trouble, the demonstrators quickly surrounded them, chanting "No violence." Secretly recorded footage of the event was broadcast on West German television, and with each following Monday meeting, the size of the protests doubled. By the end of October, more than 300,000 people marched in Leipzig's streets. The spark of revolution spread fast, and even larger demonstrations took place in East Berlin, where more than 500,000 people protested the communist regime in early November. In the wake of these events, most members of the East German government resigned.
On the evening of November 9th, 1989, an East German official was given last-minute orders in order to announce new regulations making it easier for East Berliners to obtain travel permits. He had only been given a note to read out loud, and when asked a follow-up question about when the restrictions would be lifted, he improvised. "As far as I know," he stated, "it takes effect immediately, without delay." Hearing the broadcast of this news, East Germans gathered at the wall. The guards had not been given any orders, and after frantic calls to superiors who wouldn't take responsibility, the outnumbered soldiers had no way to hold back the huge crowds. At 10:45 that night, the gates were opened. People crossed freely, climbing the wall and dancing in celebration.
In the days that followed, citizens from both sides demolished large sections of the wall using hammers and chisels. Many saved parts as souvenirs. On the first day, around 800,000 East Germans entered the West, and they were welcomed with a gift of 100 marks each. The wall officially remained guarded for some time, but new crossings were regularly introduced, and guards became more tolerant. A domino effect spread through many of the other Soviet satellite countries. Austria lifted various restrictions. An anti-communist movement openly started in Bulgaria, and Romania's head of state was overthrown. Before Christmas, the Brandenburg Gate reopened, and visa-free travel became available to all Germans. On New Year's Eve, David Hasselhoff headlined the Freedom Tour live concert, and more than 500,000 Berliners attended his performance. Hasselhoff sang his hit song, Looking for Freedom, from a platform suspended on a 20-meter crane above the wall. Just over 6 months later, Germany was formally reunified, and the Soviet Union fell soon after.
For nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall was a central icon of communist restriction. But when it fell, it transformed into a symbol of hope and freedom.
Many nations immediately responded to the events with their own fights for independence, and parts of the wall still stand today as a reminder that we have the power to break down barriers.